Welcome back. This is Common Ground. I'm Helen Moore. If you are new here, please consider subscribing. My guest today is Dr. Margaret Ellison. Dr. Ellison is a political philosopher and systems theorist. She's written extensively on state power, moral language in governance, and the historical patterns that emerge when institutions lose public trust. She's the author of Administrative Virtue and the Ethics of Emergency, and her work is taught widely across Europe and North America. Margaret, welcome.
Thank you, Helen. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
I want to start with something that I think a lot of people are struggling to articulate. When you look at what's been happening over the past few years, policy decisions, legal changes, spending priorities, it often looks, on the surface, like a kind of accumulated failure, things that don't quite work as intended. Initiatives that seem rushed, consequences that don't appear to have been fully thought through. And when people talk to me about it, they tend to describe a sense of disorientation, as if the system is responding to problems by creating new ones, or solving yesterday's issues at the expense of tomorrow's stability. My instinct, perhaps optimistically, has always been to see this as a form of institutional incompetence, a combination of ideological certainty, short-term thinking, and a kind of moral overconfidence. People convinced they're doing the right thing, and therefore not noticing the damage being done. So I suppose what I'm really asking is this. When you look at these same patterns, the outcomes rather than the intentions, do you see something similar? A system that's lost its way? Or do you think that framing itself is missing something?
I think it's a very understandable framing, and for a long time, I shared it. Incompetence is comforting, in a way. It suggests that if the right people were in the room, or if the incentives were adjusted, the system might correct itself. But over time, I became less persuaded by that explanation. Not because the individuals involved are unusually capable, but because incompetence tends to produce inconsistency, contradiction, self-sabotage. What we're seeing instead is a remarkable level of coherence in outcomes. Policies that appear unrelated nonetheless converge on the same effects. Failures that are never corrected, only expanded. Public resistance that doesn't slow the process, but seems to accelerate it. When patterns persist across departments, across crises, across leadership changes, it becomes difficult to describe them as accidental. So, I wouldn't say this is chaos. I would say it's intentional. Though I should be clear, that doesn't mean the end goal is obvious or even fully articulated. It simply means the system is behaving as if it knows what it's doing.
Let me try to ground this with a specific example, a fictional one, but representative of the kind of thing I mean. Imagine a government introduces a sweeping public safety reform. It's presented as urgent, morally necessary, and long overdue. The legislation is fast-tracked. Oversight mechanisms are removed to reduce friction. Long-standing safeguards are described as obstacles to progress. Within a relatively short period of time, the outcomes are catastrophic. Public trust collapses. Enforcement becomes visibly inconsistent. Communities feel arbitrarily targeted or abandoned. And when predictable failures emerge, legal challenges, wrongful punishments, obvious perverse incentives, none of it is meaningfully corrected. From the outside, it looks like a classic case of poor design compounded by ideological certainty. A policy driven by intent rather than competence, and then defended because admitting failure would carry political cost. That, to me, still feels like a very human kind of mistake. Overconfidence, groupthink, a refusal to slow down. So, when you look at something like that, again, hypothetically, what makes you conclude that it couldn't simply be incompetence?
Because incompetence rarely survives contact with reality. In your example, the failures you describe are immediate, visible, and, crucially, foreseeable. Any moderately experienced administrator would have warned about them in advance. Any functioning review process would have flagged them within weeks. And yet, the policy not only remains in place, it expands. Its scope widens, its penalties increase, its safeguards are further reduced. That's the point at which the explanation shifts. When a system repeatedly encounters evidence that it is causing harm and responds not by adjusting course, but by doubling down, we are no longer observing error, we are observing preference. For something like that to happen, several layers of resistance would need to fail simultaneously: legal, institutional, cultural. That doesn't occur accidentally. It requires alignment. And perhaps most tellingly, the harm itself begins to serve a function. It discourages dissent. It signals power.
I think this is where I start to struggle. Because even if I accept provisionally that some of these outcomes might be intentional, I still find it difficult to understand the moral reasoning behind them. The idea that a large number of people, many of whom would describe themselves as ethical, compassionate, even progressive, could knowingly support policies that cause such obvious harm, it feels implausible, not politically, but psychologically. Most people don't wake up intending to make life worse for others. They justify themselves, they tell stories about necessity, or trade-offs, or temporary pain for long-term good. So when I hear the argument that this is deliberate, I suppose my question becomes, deliberate in service of what? What kind of moral framework allows that level of damage, and still regards itself as virtuous?
That question, how people reconcile harm with virtue, is one of the oldest problems in political philosophy. If you look at the historical record, you'll find many examples of states that caused immense suffering while sincerely believing they were acting in the service of justice. Often they shared a common feature, a belief that society could be perfected if only the correct principles were applied, consistently and without compromise. One of the many failed communist states is a useful illustration, not because of any particular leader or event, but because of the underlying logic. The ideology begins with a moral claim that inequality itself is an injustice so severe it justifies extraordinary intervention. From there, outcomes are reclassified. Hardship becomes necessary. Dissent becomes selfish. Resistance becomes immoral. And once harm is reframed as proof of moral seriousness, as evidence that the system is willing to do what lesser systems cannot, it stops functioning as a warning signal. It becomes validation. The people involved don't experience themselves as villains. Quite the opposite. They see themselves as uniquely courageous, willing to endure criticism, chaos, even suffering, because they believe history will eventually vindicate them. That's what makes these systems so resilient to failure. Every disaster is interpreted not as a refutation, but as confirmation that they haven't gone far enough.
There are a few things you said there that I want to unpack, because they seem to connect in ways that still feel counterintuitive to me. You mentioned dissent being reframed as immoral. That resistance itself becomes evidence of selfishness or bad faith. And we've seen again, hypothetically, situations where ordinary disagreement is no longer treated as part of democratic life, but as something that needs to be managed, or limited, or discouraged for the sake of stability. At the same time, there's this increasingly strange relationship with elections. Moments where democratic processes are postponed, reinterpreted, or temporarily suspended, not to seize power openly, but, we're told, to protect democracy itself. I find that logic genuinely difficult to follow. It feels almost Orwellian, as if the language is folded back on itself. So, I suppose my question is twofold. Why does dissent become something that must be punished rather than answered? And how do elections, the very mechanism of legitimacy, come to be seen as inconvenient, even dangerous, within a system that still insists it is democratic?
Because dissent introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty is corrosive to systems that rely on moral certainty. In the kinds of ideological frameworks we're discussing, legitimacy doesn't come from consent, in the traditional sense. It comes from alignment with a set of principles that are treated as objectively correct. Once that assumption is in place, disagreement can no longer be neutral. It has to be explained, and the most efficient explanation is moral failure. If someone opposes the policy, it isn't because the policy is flawed, it's because they don't understand it, or they're insufficiently compassionate, or they're standing in the way of progress. From there, dissent stops being a democratic signal and becomes a technical problem. Elections pose a similar challenge. They introduce the possibility that the public might choose incorrectly, not maliciously, but ignorantly, or emotionally, or under the influence of the wrong narratives. So elections are reframed, not as expressions of will, but as risks, as events that must be carefully controlled, delayed, or overridden in moments of perceived moral emergency. And crucially, all of this can be done sincerely. The people involved may genuinely believe that suspending a process, silencing a voice, or narrowing the range of acceptable opinion is not a power grab, but an act of guardianship. From that perspective, staying in power isn't about self-interest, it's about preventing catastrophe. Once a system adopts that logic, it doesn't need to declare itself authoritarian. It simply stops recognizing limits.
I think I'm beginning to understand what you're saying, but I want to test it once more, because the alternative still feels extraordinary. When I look at some of these outcomes, again hypothetically, I see policies launched without infrastructure, safeguards removed before replacements exist, entire systems changed faster than anyone can realistically adapt. The results are chaotic, harmful, even, but chaotic. To me, that still looks like incompetence, like people moving too fast, guided by theory rather than reality, not thinking through second or third order consequences. Because if it were deliberate, if this level of disruption were intentional, and the implication is that the damage isn't a mistake, it's a feature. So help me understand this final step. Why would anyone choose disorder? Why would a government willingly create conditions that undermine trust, cohesion, even basic functionality?
Because disorder breaks resistance faster than force ever could. Competence preserves systems. Incompetence damages them accidentally, but sustained dysfunction reshapes them. When institutions fail repeatedly, people stop defending them. They stop trusting shared rules. They retreat into fear, dependency, or exhaustion. And in that state, they don't demand good governance, they demand relief. At that point, the question is no longer, is this working? It becomes, who can make this stop? That's why the damage appears uneven, why enforcement feels selective, why rules change without warning, why processes that once protected people quietly disappear. It isn't mismanagement, it's pressure. And once the population has adjusted to instability, once lowered expectations become normal, control becomes easier, not harder. People accept things they never would have agreed to under calm conditions. You asked earlier why dissent must be punished, because dissent reminds people that things could be otherwise.
So, it isn't about building something new yet. It's about unbuilding what already exists.
That's enough.